"Your husband patches potholes for a living," my mother said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, her eyes dragging across my paramedic uniform like I'd shown up to my sister's engagement party in a Halloween costume. "Adrian is marrying a cardiologist. His colleagues will be here tonight. Do you really think I'm going to let them see that her sister married a road crew worker?" She picked up the hand-lettered invitation from the centerpiece, the one with my name on it, and set it face down on the edge of the table like she was discarding a losing card. "Stay home Saturday, both of you." I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to feel it for the rest of the evening. The kind of pain that keeps you present when everything else is trying to make you disappear. My husband Seth's hand found my knee under the table. One squeeze. That was all. That was enough. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and looked at my mother without blinking. "All right," I said. 2 words, no wasted air. I took Seth's hand and we walked out of that restaurant together, and the doors swung shut behind us with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. She had no idea. None of them did. Because 48 hours after that Saturday wedding started without us, a Black Hawk helicopter landed in the parking lot of our county hospital. The flight surgeon who stepped out asked for me by name, my full name, my certification number, my badge. And then he said 4 words that rearranged everything I thought I understood about that day. "The governor needs you." But before I tell you why, let me take you back to the beginning. Because nothing about that Saturday made sense without it. My mother has always kept 2 different scales in her head. One for measuring people she wants something from, and one for the rest of us. My sister Adrian landed on the first scale the moment she got into pre-med at 20. I landed on the second the morning I told my mother I was dropping out of nursing school to become a paramedic instead. She'd been standing at the kitchen counter, thumbing through a magazine, and she set it down with the careful deliberateness of someone who wanted you to understand exactly how much you'd just disrupted her morning. "Paramedics ride in ambulances," she said. "Nurses have careers." I didn't argue. I'd learned by then that arguing with my mother was like trying to negotiate with weather. It didn't care what you thought. It just kept doing what it was going to do. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already made up my mind at 17, the night my neighbor Mr. Peterson collapsed in his driveway from a cardiac event, and the paramedics who arrived spent 11 minutes working on him in the dark while his wife stood on the porch in her bathrobe with her hand pressed against her mouth. He survived. I watched the whole thing from our front yard. I'd never seen anything more important happening in the world than what those 2 people with their jump bags and their calm voices were doing right there on that cracked concrete driveway. I signed my first application the next morning. My mother called it a phase. Then she called it a setback. Then she stopped calling it anything and started just not mentioning it, the way people stop mentioning an embarrassing piece of furniture they can't afford to replace. Seth came into my life 3 years into the job. He was on a road construction crew patching a stretch of Route 9 when we responded to a 2-car on the overpass. I was managing the scene and he'd already moved the cones, redirected traffic with his bare hands, and was applying pressure to the passenger's shoulder wound with his own flannel shirt when we pulled up. He looked at me when I arrived and said, "She's been conscious the whole time. Pulse is strong. She told me her name is Sandra and she has 2 kids at home." Then he stepped back and let me work. I married him 14 months later. He wore his good boots and a tie his brother helped him pick out. He cried during the vows. Not big dramatic tears, just the quiet kind that a man tries to hold back and can't quite manage, the kind that means something is real. My mother sat in the 3rd row and spent most of the reception explaining to whoever would listen that Seth was between opportunities. He was not between opportunities. He had a foreman's license, a crew of 8, and a pension he'd been paying into for 6 years. He came home every day smelling like asphalt and sunscreen and whatever he'd packed for lunch, and every single night, he asked me how my shift went before he talked about his own. Adrian's engagement to Dr. Whitmore, Nathan, everyone called him, or Doctor. Nathan, if you were my mother, happened on a Tuesday in April, announced with a photo shoot at a vineyard, and a ring my mother mentioned the price of within 48 hours of seeing it on Adrian's finger. The engagement party was at a restaurant my mother had selected based on its Michelin star and its proximity to the hospital where Nathan had his practice. She'd ordered the centerpieces herself. She'd approved the menu. She'd hand-addressed every invitation in that looping cursive she saved for occasions she wanted people to understand were serious. And then she took mine off the table. Seth said nothing the whole drive home. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the way he always did, and the country station played low, and the truck's defroster rattled in that particular key it always rattled in when the temperature dropped below 40. When we pulled into the driveway, he turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. "You okay?" he asked. I looked at his hands on the steering wheel. His right thumb had a scar across the knuckle from a rebar incident 2 summers ago, when a piece of steel snapped back and tore through his work glove. He'd finished the shift. He'd wrapped it with duct tape and a bandana from his back pocket and finished the 12 hours because two guys had called out and they were down to skeleton crew on a bridge deck that couldn't wait. The ER doctor who stitched it later told him he should have come in 6 hours earlier. Seth said he would have, but he'd had somewhere to be. "I'll be fine," I said, and I meant it. Not in the way people say it when they're not fine and they just want the conversation to end. I meant it in the way you mean something when you've been through enough to know the difference between a wound and a scratch. What my mother didn't know, what she had no way of knowing because I'd kept it sealed in a part of myself I didn't open at dinner tables, was what had happened 14 months earlier on a Tuesday morning in October. I was on shift. We got a call that came through on a secondary channel, not the standard dispatch. The address was a private property 20 minutes outside of town, a stretch of farmland that turned out to be a private airstrip. When we arrived, there was no description, no patient name, just a severity code and a set of coordinates. Our supervisor had called us back twice to confirm we'd gotten the right address. We had. The man on the ground when we arrived was in his mid-60s. Witnessed cardiac event, bystanders said, though the two bystanders present were men in dark suits who didn't give their names and stayed 6 feet back with their hands folded in front of them the entire time I worked. The patient was unconscious, no pulse, skin already going gray at the edges. My partner Keisha ran the defibrillator while I started compressions. 2 shocks, nothing. 3rd shock, a rhythm. Faint, irregular, fighting hard to exist, but there. We loaded him. I rode in the back. 37 minutes from the field to the trauma bay, and I spent 34 of them with my hands on his chest and my voice in his ear, even though I had no way of knowing whether he could hear me. I talked to him about the drive, about the weather, about the fact that his color was coming back, which it was, slowly, like sunrise coming in from the wrong direction. I told him he was going to be okay. I told him that like I knew it for certain, the way you have to tell it when someone's body is still deciding whether to stay. He stayed. I found out his name 6 weeks later when 2 people showed up at our station during a shift change. One was a woman in a gray blazer who handed me a sealed envelope and said only that it was from a private party who had requested I receive it personally. The other person stood quietly by the door. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note on heavy cream stock. The handwriting was careful, a little unsteady, the handwriting of someone who didn't write many letters by hand anymore and was taking the time to do it right. It said, "I understand from the medical team that you are the reason I have a reason to write this at all. I would like to thank you in person when you're willing. I will wait for as long as that takes. Garrett Lowell." I Googled the name that night, sitting at the kitchen table while Seth made dinner. Garrett Lowell, former state senator, current chairman of the Governor's Emergency Preparedness Council. The man credited with redesigning the state's entire disaster response infrastructure after the 2019 flooding that killed 11 people. A man whose phone calls, according to 3 different news articles I read in 40 minutes, had the capacity to redirect state resources, reshape budgets, and realign entire departments of government. I closed the laptop. Seth put a bowl of pasta in front of me and sat down. "Work stuff?" he asked. "Sort of," I said. I didn't tell him. Not because I was keeping a secret, but because the shape of it hadn't settled into anything I knew how to say out loud yet. I wrote back to Mr. Lowell 3 weeks later. I thanked him for his note. I told him I was glad he was doing well. I asked him to please keep the details of the incident private, as I preferred my work to remain between me and my patients. He honored that, completely and without question. And so for 14 months, I went to work, I came home to Seth, I listened to my mother explain at every family gathering why Adrian's choices represented the correct way to build a life. And I carried that sealed Tuesday in October in my chest like a stone I'd learned to walk with. The Saturday of the wedding arrived gray and cold, the kind of March day that can't decide if it's still winter. Seth and I spent it the way we'd started spending unexpected Saturdays off. We drove out to the state park, walked the ridge trail until our legs ached, ate sandwiches in the cab of his truck with the heat running, and came home in time for me to catch the tail end of a documentary about the Dust Bowl that I'd been meaning to watch for 2 months. I did not think about the wedding. Or I tried not to. The trying is its own kind of thinking. That evening, around 6, Seth was in the garage doing whatever project had claimed that particular weekend when my phone rang. Not my personal phone. My work phone, the one clipped to my jacket pocket out of habit even on days off. The number was a department exchange I didn't recognize. "This is Nolan," I answered. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, carrying the kind of controlled urgency that people learn to use when they need something from you immediately and can't afford for you to panic. He identified himself as a coordinator with the State Emergency Operations Team. There had been an incident at a private event, a medical emergency, serious, ongoing. They had been referred to me specifically by name. "By who?" I asked. A pause. "By Mr. Garrett Lowell." He was insistent. I was in my jacket and out the door in 4 minutes. I knocked on the garage door frame on my way past. Seth looked up from whatever he was doing, took one look at my face, and said, "I'll keep dinner warm." The Black Hawk was in the hospital parking lot. I'd never ridden in one before. I found out that afternoon that the sound is nothing like what you expect. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just loud and constant and purposeful, like a machine that has absolutely no interest in anything except getting where it's going. The event was a charity gala. The governor's annual fundraiser for state hospital infrastructure, held at a lakeside estate 40 minutes outside the city, 400 guests, black tie, the kind of event where the people in the room collectively represented more political and financial capital than most small countries. The patient was a 63-year-old woman. Severe allergic reaction, anaphylactic, her EpiPen had misfired, and the on-site EMT had exhausted their supplies and their options. She was crashing by the time I got there. I worked for 22 minutes. I don't remember most of it in sequence. I remember the sounds. The fabric of the gown someone had already cut through, the particular pitch of an oxygen saturation alarm, Keisha's voice on the phone walking me through a dosage confirmations because I'd reached for my cell by reflex and she'd picked up on the first ring even though it was her night off. I remember someone handing me supplies without being asked and discovering later it was the on-site chef who'd done 2 years of pre-med before switching to culinary school and still kept a kit in his car. She stabilized. Her name, I found out after, was Judge Eleanor Foss, Federal Circuit Court, 31 years on the bench. The woman who had written the opinion in a landmark civil rights case I'd studied briefly in a community college sociology course I'd taken 10 years ago for personal interest. When she was stable enough to speak, she looked at me from the gurney and said, in a voice that was still paper, thin from the fight her body had just been through, "What's your name, sweetheart? Nolan?" I said. "Leigh Nolan." She nodded once, slowly, like she was filing it somewhere. "I'll remember that." I stepped out to get air. The gala had not ended. 400 people in formal wear were standing in clusters on the lawn and the terrace, most of them not quite sure what had happened, only that something had. The string quartet had stopped playing. Waitstaff stood motionless at their station. A tray of untouched canapes sat on a table near the entrance, the little paper flags on each one wilting in the evening air. Garrett Lowell found me by the stone railing at the edge of the terrace. He was thinner than his photographs, and he moved with a slight lisp to his left side that hadn't been there in the older pictures. A remnant of the October event, I guessed, something that would take months more to fully resolve if it ever did. He stood beside me without speaking for a moment, both of us looking out at the lake. "I asked for you specifically," he said. "I hope that was all right." "It was," I said. "I remembered what you told me," he said, "in the ambulance, when I wasn't certain where I was." He paused. "You told me the drive was beautiful. I didn't know if that was true or if you were just saying something to keep me present. Either way, it worked." I didn't say anything. The lake was very still. Someone had turned the terrace lights on, and they made long gold reflections on the water. "I want to introduce you to some people," he said, "if you're willing." I was about to say that wasn't necessary, that I'd done what I came to do, that I had a truck and a husband and a bowl of pasta waiting for me at home. All of which were true, and all of which I genuinely preferred to the prospect of being introduced to 400 people in formal wear who were looking at me like I was something they couldn't quite categorize. But then the doors at the far end of the terrace opened, and the governor walked out. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I've replayed it enough times to have worn grooves in it. Governor Patricia Ainsworth, and I knew her name and her face the way everyone in the state did, from campaign signs and news coverage and the press conference after the flooding that I'd watched on a laptop at 2 a.m. during a slow night on shift, walked across that terrace and extended her hand to me. She said, "Mr. Lowell tells me you've now saved 2 lives at my events. I'm starting to think the state owes you a salary." And then, before I could respond, before I could manufacture a sentence that contained words in the right order, she turned to the people around us. And she said it loudly and clearly, and in the direction of the 400 guests who had been drifting closer for the last 5 minutes to see what was happening. She said, "This woman works on the county ambulance. She didn't come here tonight for the gala. She came because Garrett called her, because she was the best person he knew for the job, and because she said yes even though she had the night off. Her name is Leigh Nolan, and the state of Illinois is lucky she exists." The applause started before she finished the sentence. I am not someone who cries easily. You spend enough years in the back of an ambulance, and you learn to put your feelings in a drawer and deal with them later, preferably when you're home and horizontal, and there's no one else's emergency happening. But standing on that terrace with the lake behind me, and 400 people doing something that sounded less like applause, and more like a sustained exhalation of relief, I felt something in my chest unlock that I hadn't known was locked. I didn't know my mother was there. I hadn't known she and my father had been among the donors invited to the gala. I hadn't known that Adrian's wedding, which had started 4 hours earlier in a different part of the state, had ended early because Nathan had been called to cover an emergency consult, and the dinner portion had been condensed, and my mother had come to the gala afterward, because she was already dressed, and the donation table was in her name, and she was not a woman who wasted an outfit. I saw her when the applause began to settle. She was standing near the edge of the crowd in the ivory dress she'd been wearing in the family photo someone had posted from the wedding that afternoon. Her champagne flute was completely still in her hand. Her face was a color I didn't have a word for, not pale, not flushed, something in between, the color of a person who is in the process of revising everything they thought they understood about a situation. Garrett Lowell had been standing near enough to see where I was looking. He said nothing. He just let the moment be what it was. Later, and I want to be clear that I did not engineer what happened next, did not request it, did not in any way orchestrate it, Lowell walked across the terrace directly to my mother. I watched from a distance. I couldn't hear what he said. I saw my mother's chin, which had been at its customary elevated angle for most of the evening, lower itself a few degrees. I saw her nod. I saw her hand tighten on the champagne flute. He came back to me afterward and said only, "I told her what you asked for when I offered to compensate you. I told her you asked me to keep the whole thing private and never mention it again." He paused. She seemed surprised. "She would be," I said. There is no version of what came next that I could have predicted. My mother found me near the door as I was preparing to leave. She was alone. The champagne flute was gone. She had her evening bag pressed against her ribs with both arms, the posture of a woman who'd temporarily misplaced the confidence she usually carried like a second handbag. "Leigh." She said my name in a register I hadn't heard before, not the practiced warmth she deployed at events, not the clipped efficiency she used when she was managing something. Something smaller, something that had some of the stage scaffolding removed from it. "Mom, I didn't know," she said. "About the patient last year. About any of it. I know you didn't." She looked at me for a moment in the way that people look at things they're trying to memorize because they're not sure they'll see them again in quite the same light. "Nathan's colleagues were there tonight," she said. "3 of them. They asked me who you were when the governor spoke." She paused. "I told them you were my daughter." I looked at her steadily. "That's true," I said. "That's always been true." She didn't have a response for that. She nodded. Something in the set of her jaw wavered the way ice does in the moment before it breaks, when it's still intact but no longer quite solid. She touched my arm once, briefly, and then turned and walked back into the event. I don't know what that gesture was supposed to contain. An apology, maybe. An acknowledgement. Maybe just the opening paragraph of something that would take years to write and might never fully get finished. I didn't press it. I wasn't ready to, and honestly, neither was she. The truth between us had a lot of catching up to do. Seth was in the kitchen when I got home. He'd kept the pasta warm the way he said he would, which in Seth's language meant he'd made a completely new batch when the first one got too sticky, and there was garlic bread wrapped in foil on top of the oven. He was at the counter reading something on his phone, and he looked up when I came in. I was still in my jacket. My hair had come half out of its braids somewhere over the lake on the helicopter ride back. I probably looked like someone who'd had an extremely specific kind of day. He looked at me the way he sometimes did, not asking, just leaving space for whatever I needed to put down. I sat at the kitchen table. He put a plate in front of me. "The governor thanked me in front of 400 people tonight," I said. Seth sat down across from me. He picked up his fork. "Yeah?" In front of some of Nathan's colleagues. He looked up at that. Something in his expression shifted, recalibrated, understood. "And Mom was there," I said. He put his fork down. He looked at me carefully. "You okay?" I thought about that for a moment. I thought about Judge Foss's voice on the gurney, thin as paper but still present. I thought about the helicopter blades and the sound they made against the dark. I thought about Seth's hand on my knee under the restaurant table 3 weeks ago. One squeeze, that's all. "Yeah," I said. "I really am." We ate dinner, and the kitchen faucet dripped every few seconds the way it always did, and the dog scratched at the back door to be let in, and Seth got up to deal with that without being asked, the way he always dealt with things, without being asked. And I sat at that table, in the warm yellow light of our kitchen that we'd painted ourselves 2 summers ago, and I thought about what it cost to build a life that was actually yours. The aftermath sorted itself out the way things do when the scaffolding comes down. My mother called me 3 days later, not to ask for anything, just to call. That was new. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing much. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, maybe because for once there was no performance required from either of us. Adrian called too, the week after. She'd seen the photos someone had posted from the gala, the governor, the terrace, the applause. She didn't say much, just that she'd seen them and that she was glad I was there that night and that she loved me. I told her I loved her too. That part was always true, even when everything around it was complicated. Nathan sent a note through Adrian. It said, I heard what happened. I hope you know I've always had tremendous respect for emergency medicine. He meant well. I could tell he meant well. Some people take longer than others to understand that respect offered after the fact is still worth something, even if it would have cost less to offer it sooner. My mother did not try to explain herself or rewrite the history of the engagement party. She never brought it up again. I don't know if that was grace or avoidance, and I'm not sure it matters which one. What I noticed was that at every family occasion after that, she introduced Seth as her son-in-law, full stop, without the editorial that used to follow. That's not everything. But it's not nothing. Seth got a promotion to project manager that spring. His crew threw him a party on a job site on a Friday afternoon, plastic chairs set up on a half-finished sidewalk, someone's Bluetooth speaker playing badly, a grocery store sheet cake that said "Congrats boss" is in blue icing. He texted me a photo from the party, just the cake, no caption. He didn't need a caption. I pinned it to the corkboard in our kitchen, next to the reminder about the dog's vet appointment, and the photo from our second anniversary, when we hiked into the backcountry and got rained on for 6 straight hours and were so muddy by the end that the ranger at the trailhead asked if we needed assistance. We didn't need assistance. We never needed it less. The people in that gala room, the ones in the black ties and the gowns, the ones who measured value in credentials and conference tables and the right kind of last name, they saw something that night they hadn't expected to see. A woman in a county paramedic jacket standing in their world, summoned not by an invitation but by the fact that someone needed saving and she knew how. That's a different kind of currency. It doesn't photograph as well. It doesn't fit on a place card. But when the moment comes, when the body on the ground is someone you love, it is the only currency in the room that actually spends. I learned a long time ago, somewhere between the first code I ran and the last time I let someone else's definition of important touch the way I saw myself, that the work you do in the dark, the work nobody photographs, nobody toasts, nobody invites to the right parties, that work has its own record. It exists in the people who are still breathing who wouldn't be, in the hands that are still warm, in the voices that still pick up the phone. My hands smell like antiseptic and latex most days. Seth's smell like asphalt and machine oil. We don't have a vineyard or a Michelin-starred dinner story. We have a dripping faucet we keep meaning to fix, and a dog who scratches at the wrong door, and a corkboard covered in ordinary things that are, if you look at them right, the least ordinary things I own. That's the whole of it. That's every bit of it, and I wouldn't trade a single square inch.